Bruce. David Willis drummed his fingers lightly on the steering wheel, his low hum blending with the smooth jazz streaming from the car's sound system. The rich scent of leather from the plush seats in his brand-new Mercedes lingered in the air, a reminder of his hard-earned success. Driving along Maple Avenue, where stately homes stood proudly behind immaculately kept lawns, David couldn't help but feel a swell of satisfaction. After years of relentless effort, he had finally settled into this prestigious neighborhood. Yet his tranquil drive was abruptly interrupted when the unmistakable red and blue lights of a police cruiser flashed in his rearview mirror. His forehead creased in confusion as he pulled over. What had he done wrong? He had been well under the speed limit, simply enjoying the peaceful suburban scenery. Moments later, Officer Karen Orchid approached his window, one hand resting on her holstered weapon. "License and registration," she demanded sharply, her voice clipped and authoritative. David reached for his wallet, maintaining his calm demeanor. "Officer, may I ask what the issue is?" Ignoring his inquiry, Officer Orchid snatched the documents from his hand, her eyes cold as she reviewed them. Her gaze shifted back to him, scrutinizing. "Step out of the vehicle, sir," she commanded. David blinked in disbelief. "Excuse me, what's this about?" His confusion deepened. "I said, step out of the vehicle, now." Her hand hovered dangerously close to her holster. David's pulse quickened, but he kept his voice steady. "Officer, I'm Bruce David Willis. This is my car. I live just down the street. Surely there's been some mistake." Officer Orchid sneered. "That's what they all say. Get out of the car before I have to ask again." Slowly, David opened the door, his thoughts racing. As his shoes touched the pavement, he noticed curtains twitching in the nearby houses, his neighbors watching the scene unfold. Humiliation and fury simmered inside him, but he swallowed it down. "Turn around, hands on the car," Officer Orchid ordered sharply. "This is completely unnecessary," David protested, though he complied. "I've done nothing wrong." Her hands were rough as she patted him down. "We've had reports of vehicle thefts in this area, and this car fits the description of one stolen last week." David clenched his jaw. "I assure you this car wasn't stolen. I bought it just a few days ago. If you'd give me a moment, I can explain." "Save it for the station," she cut him off, reaching for her handcuffs. David's mind raced. He knew his rights, knew the law inside and out. But in this moment, none of that seemed to matter. The weight of systemic injustice bore down on him, an all-too-familiar feeling that gnawed at his resolve. But David Willis was not a man to be easily intimidated. "Officer Orchid," he began, his voice calm yet unyielding, "before you do something you'll regret, I strongly suggest you contact your superior. They would be very interested to know that you're about to arrest a federal Bruce without cause." She faltered for a moment, her hand lingering over the cuffs. "You expect me to believe you're a Bruce?" "I expect you to do your job properly," David replied, his tone sharpening, "which includes verifying my identity before making an unlawful arrest. Call your superior. Now." Something in his voice seemed to pierce her confidence. She hesitated, then stepped back, her expression uncertain. Reaching for her radio, she kept her eyes locked on David, the tension between them thick. As the minutes passed, David could feel the judgmental eyes of his neighbors pressing in on him. He could almost hear the whispers inside their homes. After all the sacrifices, the battles he fought to prove himself worthy of the respect and admiration that should have come with his position, he now found himself reduced to a mere suspect, just another target of suspicion in the place he had finally come to call home. Then the radio crackled, and a gruff voice responded on the other end. "What's the status, Orchid?" Officer Orchid spoke, her voice growing more uncertain with each word. When she finished, silence filled the air. "Orchid, stand down." Bruce Willis is a well-respected figure. I'm heading over now." The color drained from Officer Orchid's face as she lowered the radio. She glanced at David, her eyes filled with confusion and shame. I'm sorry, Your Honor. It seems there's been a misunderstanding." David straightened his jacket, maintaining his dignity despite the situation. "A misunderstanding? Is that what we're calling racial profiling now, Officer Orchid?" Before she could reply, another police car arrived. Out stepped a tall, older man with salt and pepper hair, Captain Peter, head of the precinct. "Bruce Willis," he called, walking over. "I can't begin to apologize for this. We'll look into it right away." David nodded, his mind racing with the larger meaning of what had just happened. This wasn't just about him. It was about every person of color wrongly accused, every life torn apart by unchecked bias. As Captain Peter turned to address Officer Orchid, David made a decision that would change not only his life, but the lives of many others. "Captain," he said, his voice strong, "I'd like to speak with both you and Officer Orchid. Not as a victim, but as someone who believes we can use this moment to grow and learn." Captain Peter looked surprised, but nodded with respect. "Of course, Your Honor. Whatever you need." As they walked toward the captain's car, David couldn't help but wonder, could this be the start of real change? Or would it just fade into the long history of injustice? Little did he know, this was just the first step on a journey that would test everything he thought he knew about justice, prejudice, and the power of one person to spark change. "Captain," David began as they reached the car, "we need to have a real talk about policing in this community. Do you agree?" Captain Peter nodded with a serious look. "You're right, Bruce Willis. This event has made me see things I thought were already fixed." "I'm listening," Peter said quietly, his face stern. David took a deep breath, his gaze shifting between Peter and Officer Orchid, who stood nearby, looking both ashamed and defensive. "Let's be clear," David said. "This wasn't a simple mistake. It was racial profiling." Officer Orchid opened her mouth to respond, but Peter raised his hand, stopping her. "Go on, Bruce," he said, his tone heavy with seriousness. "What happened today is part of a bigger problem," David continued. "This isn't about one officer or one event. It's about a system that, often without meaning to, allows bias and prejudice to take root." A small crowd had begun to form as David spoke. Neighbors who had watched from their windows now standing outside, drawn by the presence of the police captain and the composed man they realized was Bruce Willis. "I propose we use this as a chance to make things better," David said, his voice rising in the still air. "Not by punishing or shaming, but through learning and understanding." Captain Peter raised an eyebrow. "And what exactly do you have in mind, Bruce?" David turned to face Officer Orchid directly. "Officer, I don't want you to lose your job. That won't solve anything. Instead, I invite you to shadow me in my courtroom for a week." Officer Orchid blinked, startled. "Your Honor? You'll see firsthand the struggles that people of color face in our justice system," David explained. "You'll witness how hidden biases affect everything, from sentencing to jury selection and beyond." Captain Peter slowly nodded. "That's an interesting idea, Bruce, but I'm not sure our department has the time or—" "I'll handle it," David said, cutting him off. "I'll talk to the chief myself if needed. We can't let red tape block something this important." As the conversation continued, Mrs. Thompson, David's neighbor, hesitantly approached. "Bruce Willis, is everything okay? We saw what happened and, well, we're all pretty shocked." David turned to her with a kind smile. "Everything's fine, Mrs. Thompson. In fact, I think something good might come out of all this." A thought flickered in David's mind, and he turned to face Captain Peter. "Captain, What if we expand this initiative, not just for Officer Orchid, but for the entire precinct? In exchange, I and other Bruces could spend time with your officers, getting a clearer picture of the daily struggles they confront. Captain Peter's eyes widened in surprise. That's a bold idea, Bruce, but I can see the advantages. It's more than advantages, David emphasized. It's about tearing down the barriers that divide us. It's about fostering understanding and empathy, both ways. As David spoke, he could sense the shift in the air. The neighbors who had gathered began nodding in agreement, and even Officer Orchid, who had been standing rigidly off to the side, seemed to lean in, listening closely. We have a unique opportunity here, David continued, to transform a moment of conflict into an opportunity for growth, to show our community that justice in its truest form is what we're committed to. Captain Peter rubbed his chin thoughtfully. It won't be easy. There'll be pushback from my officers and even within the judicial system. Nothing worthwhile is ever easy, Captain, David replied, with a determined glint in his eye. But it's essential. What happened today, it's not an isolated incident. It's happening all over this country every day, and it won't stop unless we take deliberate steps to change it. As David finished speaking, he noticed a young boy standing on the sidewalk, watching wide-eyed. It was Adam, the son of a neighbor, who often waved at David when he left for work. David walked over, crouching down to Adam's eye level. "Hey, Adam, what do you make of all this?" Adam glanced nervously at the officers, then back at David. "I'm not sure. My dad says we should always respect the police, but they were being mean to you, and you didn't do anything wrong." David nodded solemnly. "You're right, Adam. I didn't do anything wrong. But here's what's important. The police are here to protect us. Sometimes they make mistakes just like anyone else. What really matters is how we respond to those mistakes. Do we get angry and turn our backs on each other, or do we try to understand and work together to be better?" Adam thought for a moment, then smiled. "Work together?" David chuckled, gently ruffling the boy's hair. "Exactly. That's what we're going to try to do." Standing up, David turned back to Captain Peter and Officer Orchid. "This isn't just about us. It's about creating a future for kids like Adam, a future where they don't have to fear being bruised by the color of their skin, whether they're walking down the street or driving a car." Captain Peter nodded, a new resolve in his eyes. "You're right, Bruce. We owe it to the next generation to do better. I'll back your initiative and fight to implement it throughout the department." Officer Orchid stepped forward, her voice quiet yet steady. "Your Honor, I want to apologize. I made assumptions based on, well, prejudices I wasn't even aware of. I'd be honored to be part of your program." David extended his hand. "Thank you, Officer Orchid. Owning up to mistakes and being willing to learn, that's the first step toward real change." As they shook hands, the gathered neighbors began to clap softly. Mrs. Thompson, an elderly woman, wiped away a tear. "Bruce Willis, we're lucky to have you here. Is there anything we can do to help?" David looked around at the faces of his neighbors, some filled with guilt, others with hope and determination. "Actually, yes. This isn't just about the police or the courts. It's about all of us, our entire community. I'd like to start holding town hall meetings where we can discuss these issues openly and honestly." Captain Peter nodded in agreement. "The police department will gladly participate, Bruce. It's time we had real conversations with the community we serve." As murmurs of agreement spread through the crowd, David felt a flicker of hope. What had started as a tense, potentially dangerous encounter was evolving into something more, something powerful, a movement that could ripple far beyond their small neighborhood. But he also knew that the real work was just beginning. Changing hearts and minds wouldn't happen overnight. It would take time, patience, and persistence. "Well," David said, clapping his hands together, "I think we've had enough excitement for one day. Captain Peter, Officer Orchid, how about we meet tomorrow to start hammering out the details?" As the crowd began to disperse and the police prepared to leave, Mrs. Thompson approached David once again. "Bruce Willis," she said softly. "I have to confess, when you first moved into the neighborhood, I wasn't sure about you. I'm ashamed of that now. I hope you can forgive an old woman's foolishness." David smiled warmly. "Mrs. Thompson, forgiveness is the first step toward understanding. I'm just glad we're on the right path now." As David watched the last police car disappear down the street, a strange mix of weariness and adrenaline coursed through him. He turned toward his house, already planning his next moves. But something tugged at his thoughts. Something about the entire situation felt wrong. It wasn't just the traffic stop, but the unsettling feeling that there was more going on beneath the surface. David couldn't quite pinpoint what it was, but a nagging suspicion whispered at the back of his mind that this incident was far from random. Shaking his head, he tried to push the thoughts aside. "One step at a time," he muttered as he reached for his front door, unlocking it and stepping inside. Little did he know, those steps were leading him into something far more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. As the door clicked shut behind him, his phone buzzed. Glancing down, he saw a text from an unknown number. The message was chillingly brief. "Watch your back." David felt the blood drain from his face, his pulse quickening. What had he just gotten himself into? His mind raced as he quickly locked the door and pulled the curtains shut. What started as a routine traffic stop now felt like the beginning of something much darker. Had it been more than just racial profiling? His instincts as a Bruce kicked in, urging him to gather more information before jumping to conclusions. He saved the unknown number, took a screenshot of the message, and immediately dialed his closest friend, Detective Marcus Johnson, a man he trusted with his life. The phone barely rang once before Marcus picked up. "Marcus, it's David. I need a favor, off the record." There was a pause before Marcus spoke, his tone filled with concern. "What's going on, David?" David gave a quick rundown of the day's events, ending with the ominous text message. "I need you to trace this number." Quietly. "Consider it done," Marcus said, his voice steady. "But David, if someone's coming after you, we can't just sit on this. We need to loop in the higher-ups." "Not yet," David replied firmly. "I want to understand what we're dealing with first. Let's gather some information." After hanging up, David paced the room, his earlier sense of hope evaporating into growing unease. Over the years, he had made plenty of enemies. It came with the territory of being a Bruce. But this felt deeply personal, like someone was out for more than just revenge. A knock at the door startled him, his heart leaping into his throat. He approached cautiously, peering through the peephole. On the other side stood Adam, a neighborhood kid, shifting uncomfortably on his feet. Forcing a smile, David opened the door. "Hey, Adam. What's up, buddy?" Adam looked up at him with wide, anxious eyes. "Bruce Willis? I heard my dad on the phone. He was really mad and he said your name. He was talking about teaching you a lesson. I thought you should know." David's pulse quickened, though he kept his voice steady for the boy's sake. "That's really brave of you, Adam. Thanks for telling me. Now, head on home, okay? Everything's going to be fine. Adam nodded and ran off, leaving David standing in the doorway, his mind racing. Ethan Robin, Adam's father, was a local businessman. David had ruled against him in a discrimination case last year. Could Jack be behind the threat? Before he could dive deeper into his thoughts, his phone rang. It was Marcus. "David, I've uncovered something," Marcus said, his voice low but urgent. "That number. It's a burner phone. I tracked its recent calls. Guess where they've been dialing?" David's heart skipped a beat. "Where?" he asked, his grip tightening around the phone. "The police station," Marcus replied. "David, I don't know what this means, but it's bigger than we imagined. You need to be careful." As David hung up, he collapsed into his armchair, the weight of the revelation pressing down on him. He had set out to make a difference, to reform the system from the inside. But now it felt like the very system was turning against him. He was deep in thought when the doorbell rang. Startled, he stood up, heart pounding, and opened the door to find Captain Peter waiting on his porch. "Bruce Willis," Captain Peter said grimly, stepping inside. "We need to talk." David guided him to the living room, his nerves frayed. "What's this about, Captain?" Peter looked worn, as if carrying the burden of bad news. "There's no easy way to say this. We've received an anonymous tip. There are accusations against you. Bribery, misconduct, on the bench. They're claiming you've been taking payoffs." David felt the ground shift beneath him. "That's impossible. You can't honestly believe—" "I don't know what to believe, David," Peter interrupted, his face somber. "But I had to warn you. There's going to be an investigation, and it's not looking good." The captain's words lingered in the air long after he left. David slumped back into his chair, his mind racing. The traffic stop, the text, Adam's cryptic warning, and now these accusations. Someone was setting him up, trying to take him down. But who? And more importantly, why? David spent the entire night tossing and turning, his thoughts a whirlwind of suspicion and confusion. By dawn, David began poring over old case files, court transcripts, anything that might point him in the right direction. As he sifted through the paperwork, a pattern began to emerge. Many of his recent rulings had gone against a company called B. Gray Builders. They had been cited for safety violations, environmental infractions, and discrimination. The owner of B. Gray Builders? Ethan Robin, Adam's father. But something still didn't make sense. How did this tie back to the police? And why now? A knock at the door snapped him out of his thoughts. Peering through the peephole, he saw Officer Orchid standing nervously on the other side. He opened the door, just a crack. "Officer Orchid? What brings you here?" She glanced around nervously before stepping inside. "Bruce Willis, I need to talk to you. It's about what happened yesterday. There's more to it than you think." David locked the door behind her, his pulse quickening. "What do you mean?" Orchid hesitated, then took a deep breath. "That traffic stop. It wasn't random. I was ordered to pull you over." David's eyebrows shot up. "Ordered? By who?" "I don't know," she whispered, her voice shaky. "It came from higher up. They told me to find any reason to pull you over, to try and escalate the situation. I didn't know why at the time. But now—" She looked down, her hands trembling. "When I heard about the allegations against you, I realized something wasn't right. What you said yesterday, it hit me. I didn't become a cop to be someone's puppet. I want to help people, not be part of whatever this is." David sank into his chair, absorbing the weight of her confession. Before he could respond, there was another knock at the door. This time, it was Marcus, his expression tense. This was no longer just about David. It was about deep-rooted corruption that stretched from the local precinct all the way to the city's upper echelons. We need proof, David said, his legal instincts kicking in. Without hard evidence, it's just our word against theirs. Marcus nodded in agreement. I might be able to dig up some internal police records, trace the connections between B. Gray and those crooked officers. I can help, Orchid added, a new resolve hardening her gaze. I know who to watch. Which ones have been acting shady? David glanced at both of them, feeling a flicker of hope. It's dangerous, he warned, knowing the risks. Marcus didn't hesitate. It's worth it. This is bigger than us. As they began to strategize, David couldn't shake the creeping feeling of dread. They were walking straight into a lion's den, up against people with power and reach, who would stop at nothing to protect their empire. But turning back wasn't an option now. Too much was on the line. His career, his name, and most of all, the very essence of justice itself. The fading daylight cast long shadows in David's living room as he made a silent vow. As they worked out the final details of their plan, David's phone buzzed with another message from the unknown number. Back off, Bruce. Last warning. He held up the screen for Marcus and Orchid to see. Their expressions tightened with resolve. They're getting scared, Marcus said flatly. We're onto something. Orchid nodded, her jaw clenched. So, what's next, Bruce? David looked at his unlikely companions, a detective and an officer he'd once met under the worst circumstances. He exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the coming storm. We follow the money, he said with conviction. Every dirty deal leaves a paper trail. We just have to find it. As night draped the city in darkness, the trio huddled around laptops and stacks of documents, oblivious to the unseen eyes tracking their every move. The game was in motion, and the stakes were far higher than they ever anticipated. Hours passed, and tension mounted. David, Marcus, and Officer Orchid sifted through piles of evidence, cross-referencing dates, names, and suspicious transactions. The room buzzed with the quiet hum of their computers, while papers cluttered the table. "Look at this," Marcus said suddenly, eyes locked on his screen. "There's a pattern, large deposits into Dean Parasut account. They line up with key decisions that benefited B. Gray." David leaned closer, narrowing his eyes. "Can we tie those deposits directly to B. Gray?" Marcus shook his head. "Not directly. The money's funneled through a shell company. But here's the kicker. The shell company was set up by a law firm that handles several of B. Gray's cases." "Duh." Officer Orchid chimed in, her voice tight. "Richards has been pushing for increased patrols around properties owned by B. Gray. He claimed it was for community safety. But now we know better." David's face darkened. "This is still circumstantial. We need something undeniable. Concrete proof linking B. Gray to the department." A sharp knock on the door made all three jump. David's heart pounded as he approached cautiously, peeking through the peephole. His pulse quickened when he saw who was on the other side. "It's Captain Peter," he whispered. Marcus and Orchid shared uneasy glances. "Should we hide?" Orchid asked, her voice tense with uncertainty. David hesitated, weighing their options. Then he shook his head. "No. If Peter is in on this, hiding you will only make us look guilty. If he's not, he might be able to help." Taking a deep breath, he opened the door, forcing a calm smile. Captain Peter. This is unexpected. His face was stony, the weight of unspoken concerns lingering in his eyes. "Bruce Willis, may I come in?" As Peter stepped inside, his gaze shifted, and the surprise was evident as he took in the sight of Marcus and Orchid. "Detective Johnson, Officer Orchid, what exactly is going on here?" David drew a deep breath, his pulse quickening. This was the moment. There was no turning back now. "Captain, we're investigating corruption within the department and its ties to B. Gray Builders. The traffic stop incident and the allegations against me are just pieces of a much bigger puzzle." Peter's expression didn't waver. Then, to everyone's surprise, he exhaled deeply, his shoulders slumping as he sank into a nearby chair. "I knew something was off," he admitted, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "For months, I've been seeing things that didn't add up. Every time I tried to dig deeper, I hit a dead end." David felt a wave of relief wash over him, his body relaxing for the first time in what felt like days. "So you're not involved?" Peter shook his head. "No, but I've been cautious. Maybe too cautious. These people, whoever they are, have influence, real power. I couldn't risk my family, my pension." Orchid stepped forward, determination hardening her features. "Captain, we need your help. We're close to cracking this wide open, but there are records only you have access to." Peter glanced around the room, his internal struggle visible in the tightening of his jaw. Finally, he gave a slow nod. "All right, I'm in. Tell me what you need." As the night stretched into early morning, the team worked relentlessly, uncovering a tangled web of fabricated reports, shady financial transfers, and suspicious promotions. With Peter's help, piece by piece, the puzzle started to make sense. The golden light of dawn began to filter through the windows, bathing the room in a soft glow. "We've got the proof," Marcus said, rubbing his temples, exhaustion creeping into his voice. "But how do we use it? If we hand this over to the wrong people, it could disappear, just like everything else. These folks are connected all the way to the mayor's office." David paced the room, the wrinkles in his shirt from the day before mirrored in his brow. His coffee cup lay forgotten, its contents staining the table. "We need to go public. Get the evidence into the hands of someone beyond their reach. Someone they can't intimidate or buy off." "The press?" Orchid offered cautiously. Peter shook his head. "Too dangerous. We don't know who's on their payroll. It could blow up in our faces." A flicker of memory sparked in David's mind. "Wait, I know someone. Mia Jiang, an old law school friend of mine. She's with the State Attorney General's office now. If we can get this to her, it might just work." Marcus nodded, his eyes sharpening with a renewed sense of hope. The state AG's office would be far enough removed from these local power players. It's worth a shot. Just as they began to outline their plan to contact Sarah, a sudden, shrill sound cut through the quiet, the unmistakable blare of a car alarm. Everyone tensed, eyes darting to the windows. David rushed to the nearest one, his hand trembling as he pulled back the curtain. His heart sank. "We've got company," he muttered, his voice tense. "There are 2 unmarked cars across the street, and the men inside." "They're watching us." Peter joined him at the window, his expression darkening. "They must have caught wind of what we're doing. We need to get out of here, now." "But how?" Orchid asked, fear creeping into her voice. "They'll see us the moment we step outside." David's mind raced, searching for any possible solution. Then it hit him. "The back gate," he said, his voice steadying. "There's a way out they won't be expecting." The alley led to the neighboring street, a narrow path tucked between old buildings. "I've got an idea," Peter said, glancing at the others, "but we'll need a diversion." Without wasting time, they formulated a quick plan. Peter would exit through the front, drawing the eyes of the watchers, while the rest would slip out the back under the cover of the early morning light. "Text me when you're clear," Peter instructed, his voice low and steady. "Head straight for the State Attorney General's office. Don't stop for anything. If I shake these guys, I'll meet you there." As Peter prepared to leave, David gripped his arm. "Thank you, Captain, for everything," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. Peter met his gaze and nodded solemnly. "Just promise me this, Bruce. When all of this is over, we clean house. For real this time. No shortcuts." David gave a firm nod. "You have my word." Peter strode out the front door, making a show of checking his watch before hurrying to his car. Just as planned, one of the unmarked cars outside peeled out to follow him. "This is our chance," Marcus whispered, his pulse quickening. David took the lead, guiding Marcus and Orchid through the kitchen and out the back door. They crept along the fence, keeping low, and made their way to the gate. David opened it slowly, the hinges groaning in protest, and they slipped into the alley. As they reached the end of the alley, a shout rang out behind them. "They've seen us!" Orchid hissed, panic rising in his voice. "Run!" David ordered. They bolted toward Marcus's car, parked a block away. Footsteps and angry voices echoed behind them. Just as they reached the car, a gunshot rang out, shattering the rear window. Marcus floored the gas pedal, tires screeching as they sped away. "Is everyone okay?" David asked, his heart pounding in his chest. "I'm hit," Orchid gasped from the back seat, clutching his arm. "It's just a graze." "Hang on," Marcus growled, weaving through traffic. "We're almost there." David clutched the flash drive in his pocket. The small device that held everything they had risked their lives for. But as they neared the state attorney general's office, David's heart sank. A police barricade stretched across the street, lights flashing. "It's a setup," he muttered under his breath. "They were expecting us." Marcus's hands tightened on the wheel. "What now, Bruce?" David closed his eyes, thinking rapidly. They had no time, no backup, and no options left. When he opened his eyes, he had made up his mind. "The media," he said. "It's our only chance. Marcus, head for Channel 7 News. We're going to expose the truth to the whole city." Marcus swerved onto a side street, narrowly avoiding the blockade. They were running out of time. David knew their pursuers would figure out their new destination soon enough, but for now, they had a small head start. And sometimes, David thought, a small lead was all you needed. As they sped through the waking city, the first light of dawn reflected off the towering buildings. David sent up a silent prayer. They had one shot to bring down the corrupt system, one chance to reveal everything. "Hold on!" Marcus yelled, taking a sharp turn. "We're almost there!" The Channel 7 building loomed ahead, a beacon of hope. But just as they neared it, David noticed more police cars converging from the side streets. "They're closing in," he said urgently. "Marcus, we need to—" His words were cut off as their car was violently struck by an SUV, sending it spinning. Metal screeched, glass shattered, and the world went black. David came to with a groan, his head pounding and the taste of blood in his mouth. Smoke filled the air, and the car lay on its side, crumpled like a toy. Marcus was slumped over the wheel, a nasty cut on his forehead. In the back seat, Orchid stirred, grimacing in pain. "Marcus! Orchid!" David called out, his voice hoarse. Marcus groaned, lifting his head slowly. I'm okay. Still here," Orchid mumbled, wincing. "But I can't move my leg. It's stuck." Sirens wailed in the distance, getting closer. They were running out of time. David frantically patted his pockets, relief flooding him when his hand closed around the flash drive. The evidence was still safe. "We have to get out of here," David said, unbuckling his seatbelt. "Marcus, can you move?" With effort, Marcus pushed open his door and climbed out, followed by David. They turned to help Orchid, who was still trapped. "My leg's pinned," she said, her voice rising with fear. "We'll get you out," David promised. He and Marcus pulled at the wreckage, their hands bleeding from the sharp metal. The sirens grew louder, but they managed to create enough space for Orchid to crawl out. David caught her as she stumbled. "We can't outrun them," Marcus said, glancing at the approaching police cars. "Not with Orchid hurt." David made a split-second decision. "You two create a diversion. I'll run to the news station and get this out." "No," Orchid protested. "We do this together." "Listen," David urged, his voice low and intense. "This is bigger than all of us. The truth has to come out, no matter the cost. I'm the only one who stands a real chance of getting through." Marcus and Orchid exchanged uneasy glances before giving reluctant nods. "Stay safe, Bruce," Marcus said quietly. "You too," David responded. He pressed the flash drive into Marcus's hand. "If I don't make it, find a way to release this." With that, David broke into a sprint toward the Channel 7 building, the sounds of Marcus and Orchid's shouts echoing behind him, distracting the officers closing in. David's lungs burned as he pounded the pavement, each breath a struggle, as his body, still reeling from the crash, protested with every movement. But the need to expose the truth was greater than the pain. He was halfway to the building when a police cruiser screeched to a halt ahead of him. Without hesitating, David veered into an alley, his pulse racing as the sound of heavy footsteps followed close behind. The alley was a cluttered maze of dumpsters, fire escapes and narrow pathways. He weaved through, leaping over trash bins and ducking under low-hanging pipes. His pursuer was closing in, the sound of labored breathing growing louder. Just as David felt his lead shrinking, he spotted a slightly ajar door in the side of a building. He darted inside, heart pounding, finding himself in a dimly lit storeroom stacked with cleaning supplies. David crouched behind a pile of boxes, straining to quiet his ragged breathing as the officer's footsteps thundered past the door. For a brief moment, there was silence. Then, the crackle of a radio broke through. "All units, be advised. Suspect David Willis is headed toward Channel 7 News. Apprehend at all costs. Suspect is armed and dangerous." A chill ran down David's spine. They were framing him, painting him as a violent criminal to discredit him before he could expose the truth. He needed to reach the news station before their version of the story took over. Carefully, he slipped out of the storeroom and navigated through the deserted office building. As he passed a window, realization struck him. He was in the building next to Channel 7. An idea formed, wild and risky, but it might be his only shot. David found the stairwell and ascended to the roof. The early morning air was cool against his sweat-drenched skin. Ahead, the Channel 7 building loomed, separated by a narrow alley, no more than 10 feet wide. David took a deep breath, backing up for a running start. "I must be out of my mind," he muttered before charging across the roof. As he reached the edge, he leaped with all his strength. Time seemed to slow as he sailed through the air, the alley yawning beneath him. Then, with a thud, his feet hit the opposite roof, and he rolled to break his fall. Breathless but alive, David stood. He'd made it. He was on top of Channel 7. Finding the roof access door, he descended into the building. The hum of the newsroom below indicated they were preparing for the morning broadcast. David's mind raced. How could he convince them to put him on air? Would they even believe him? Bursting into the newsroom, all heads turned to him. "I'm Bruce David Willis," he announced, his voice echoing in the shocked silence. "I have evidence of widespread corruption within the police force and city government. I need to go live. Now." For a moment, the room was frozen. Then a woman stepped forward, her expression sharp and calculating. "I'm Linda Chen, executive producer. You've got 2 minutes to convince me why I should risk my career on this." David drew a deep breath and began to recount everything. The evidence of shady deals between B-grade builders and corrupt officials, the threats and attempts to silence him. As he spoke, he watched Linda's face shift from skepticism to shock, then determination. When he finished, she paused for a long moment. Then she turned to her team. "Get him into makeup. We're going live in 10 minutes. A flurry of activity surrounded David. As a makeup artist patched up his bruises, Linda leaned in, briefing him. "We'll introduce you. You've got 5 minutes. Be clear, be concise, and expect pushback. Once this goes live, there's no turning back." David nodded, his heart hammering in his chest. This was it, the moment of truth. As they led him to the set, his eyes caught a glimpse of a TV screen in the corner, the countdown to broadcast ticking away. David's heart skipped a beat as the footage of Marcus and Orchid being taken into custody played on the screen. He knew he had to clear their names, not just for himself, but for their sake too. The harsh studio lights were almost blinding as David settled into his seat. The anchor, with his perfectly manicured hair, shot him a curious glance. "We're live in 30 seconds, a voice from behind the camera called. David closed his eyes, taking a deep breath to center himself. His mind wandered to those wronged by this deeply flawed system, Marcus and Orchid, who had risked everything for him, and young Adam, who was growing up in a world where justice was more of a fantasy than a reality. "And we're live in 3, 2, 1, came the countdown. The anchor's voice, smooth and practiced, filled the room. "We interrupt our regular programming for a special report. Joining us today is Bruce David Willis, who claims to have uncovered significant corruption within our city's government and police force. Bruce Willis, the floor is yours." David looked directly into the camera, his voice unwavering. "Citizens of this great city, I stand before you today with a heavy heart and an urgent message. Our justice system, the cornerstone of our society, has been tainted." As David laid out the evidence and unraveled the intricate web of corruption, the faces of the crew around him betrayed their shock. In the background, phones began to ring off the hook. He was midway through his explanation when the studio doors swung open. A group of police officers, led by Dean Parisot, stormed in. "Cut the feed!" Dean roared. "This man is under arrest." But Linda Chen, the courageous producer, stepped in front of the camera. "We're live, gentlemen. If you interfere, millions of viewers will witness it." Dean hesitated, caught between following orders and the inevitable public backlash. David seized the moment. "Citizens, what you are witnessing is an attempt to bury the truth. Don't let them silence me. Demand the answers you deserve. Demand justice." As the officers moved closer, David stood tall, his voice resolute. "The truth will come out, no matter what happens to me. Remember this day. Remember that one voice can change everything." The last image the viewers saw before the feed abruptly cut off was David, head held high, being led away in handcuffs. But as the officers escorted him out, David knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a much bigger fight. Across the city, police radios buzzed with frantic messages. On street corners, groups huddled around their phones, watching clips of David's bold broadcast. In homes, citizens were beginning to ask questions. The flame of revolution had been sparked, and now it was up to the people to fan it into a wildfire of change. As David was pushed into the back of a squad car, he caught a glimpse of the city's skyline glowing under the soft morning light. Despite everything, a glimmer of hope bloomed in his chest. The truth was out now. The police car sped through the waking city, David's thoughts racing with it. As the car pulled into the station, a throng of reporters was already waiting. Camera flashes exploded like fireworks as David, still handcuffed, was led inside with his head held high. Inside the station, chaos reigned. Officers whispered heatedly, phones rang without pause, and tension thickened the air. They escorted David to a stark interrogation room and left him alone, the door slamming shut with a hollow thud. Hours crawled by. David could hear the muffled sounds of shouting and hurried footsteps just beyond the door. Finally, the door creaked open. To his surprise, it was Captain Peter, looking worn but determined. "Bruce Willis," Peter began in a low voice, "you've stirred up quite the storm." David leaned forward, curiosity sparking. "What's happening out there, Captain?" Peter sank into the chair across from him. "Your broadcast. It's gone viral. It's on social media. The news. Even international channels are picking it up. People are taking to the streets, demanding answers." A flicker of hope reignited within David. "And the evidence? The flash drive?" "Safe," Peter confirmed. "Detective Johnson got it to Mia Jang at the Attorney General's office before he was detained. They're combing through it now." David exhaled, a weight lifting off his chest. "So, what's next?" Before Peter could respond, the door burst open once more. Dean Parisot stormed in, his face flushed with anger. "You're done for, Willis," Dean growled, his voice full of venom. "By the time we're through with you, you'll be lucky to see daylight from outside a prison cell." "That's enough, Dean Parisot," came a new voice from the entrance. Mia Jang entered the room, flanked by two stern-faced federal agents. "By the order of the Attorney General, this entire department is now under investigation. Dean Parisot, you are under arrest for corruption, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy." As the agents cuffed Dean and led him away, his protests echoing down the hallway, Mia turned to David. "You took a huge risk, my friend, but it paid off. We've got more than enough evidence to bring down half the city's government." In the days that followed, David found himself swept up in a whirlwind of legal proceedings, media coverage, and public outrage. The evidence he and his team had collected was explosive. One by one, corrupt officials were brought down, from low-ranking officers to city leaders entrenched in years of illegal activity. B. Gray Builders, the construction company at the heart of it all, was exposed and dismantled. Even Ethan Robin, Adam's father, faced charges of bribery and fraud, a public symbol of the city's systemic rot. But despite the sense of victory, David couldn't shake an unsettling feeling. The corrupt individuals may have been removed, but the system that allowed them to thrive still remained. Real change would take more than just removing a few bad players. This thought weighed heavily on David's mind and led to a decision that would alter the course of his life. On a crisp fall morning, David stood before a crowd of reporters and citizens, the city skyline gleaming in the background. He took a deep breath, steadying himself for what he was about to say. "Citizens of this great city, we have endured a storm of corruption and betrayal. We've seen how those entrusted with power can abuse it for personal gain. But we've also seen the strength of truth and the courage of those willing to stand up for justice." He paused, surveying the sea of faces, some filled with skepticism, others with hope. "But it's not enough to simply remove the bad apples. We must examine the entire orchard. That's why today I am announcing my resignation from the bench." Gasps rippled through the crowd, and murmurs spread quickly, but David held up his hand, silencing them. "I am stepping down, not because of guilt or shame, but because I believe I can do more outside the system. I'm forming an independent watchdog organization, committed to rooting out corruption and ensuring transparency in our government and law enforcement. As David continued outlining his plans, he could see the varied reactions: surprise, respect, and even a glimmer of optimism. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but David was ready for the challenge. He built a team of passionate, like-minded individuals, including Marcus and Orchid, who had been fully exonerated. 1 year later, David stood in a modest community center in the very neighborhood where he'd once been unjustly stopped by police. The room was packed, a diverse mix of faces, all eager to hear about the progress his organization had made. As he scanned the crowd, his eyes landed on a familiar face: Adam. The boy had grown, his face more mature, but his eyes still had that spark of curiosity. After the meeting, Adam approached David, standing a little taller than before. "Mr. Willis, I just wanted to say thank you. What you did, it changed everything. My dad's in prison now, but I get it, and I want to help, like you did." A lump rose in David's throat. He placed a firm hand on Adam's shoulder. "You've already helped, Adam. That day, you stood up, and that's where it all begins. One person, one moment of doing the right thing." As Adam left, David felt a renewed sense of purpose. The battle wasn't over. There would always be those who sought to twist power for their own benefit. But there would also always be people like Adam, people willing to fight for what was right. Later that evening, as David stood on the balcony of his apartment, gazing out at the sprawling city, he knew the journey ahead would be long. But he was ready to face whatever came next. The city lights flickered against the night sky, each one telling a story, a life filled with possibility and the hope for change. David stood on his balcony, reflecting on how far they had come, yet mindful of how much further they still had to go. The system was far from flawless. It might never reach perfection, but it was better now, more transparent, more accountable. Most importantly, people were no longer indifferent. They were alert, watching, questioning, and demanding more from their leaders and institutions. As he turned to head inside, his phone buzzed. It was Mia Jiang from the Attorney General's office. "New lead on corruption in the mayor's office. Are you up for another fight?" David's lips curled into a smile. Many would be disheartened by the thought of yet another battle. But for him, it was a reminder of why he had embarked on this journey in the first place. He quickly typed a reply: "Always." Closing the balcony door behind him, David felt a calmness settle over him. He had chosen a tough path, one with no clear end, but it was the right path. As long as there were people willing to stand for what was just, there was hope. The city lay in deep slumber, unaware of the battles being fought in its name. But David Willis was wide awake, ready to take on whatever challenges the new day would bring. He knew now, more than ever, that one voice could truly make a difference. What had started with a routine traffic stop had brought him to this moment, a place he never could have imagined. He thought of the lives that had been touched, the changes that had been set in motion, and he felt a deep, unshakable certainty that it had all been worth it. With renewed determination, David turned to face the sunrise. The fight for justice wasn't over, not by a long shot, but he was ready to stand tall, to speak truth to power, and to be the change he wanted to see in the world. As the sun fully rose, casting its warm glow over the city, David Willis stepped forward into a future filled with challenges, but also brimming with hope. He had learned the most valuable lesson. In the face of injustice, silence was never an option. Even in the darkest moments, one voice, raised in the name of truth and justice, could light the way forward.